If you've been playing poker for a while and done any amount of study, chances are a lot of the beginner content on YouTube is just too basic for you. But the advanced stuff might be a little over your head, terms might not make any sense, and these strategies really just, you don't know what to do with them yet. And if that's the case, then you're an intermediate player. But the thing is that intermediate players tend to make very similar mistakes as well. So today I'm going to give you 6 of them and give you the fixes for each of them, just in case you're making any of these mistakes too. Let's get started. Good morning, how we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. Welcome back to another video, and today I want to talk specifically to intermediate players. That's you, right? If so, great, you're in the right place. If you're more of a beginner player and somehow you made it this far in the video, click on that video, leave a card up there for the video specifically meant for beginner players trying to fix some leaks. But if you're an intermediate player and you know, hey, I want to get into more advanced stuff, but you're not really sure how, the leaks we're going to talk about in this video are the things you have to fix if you have any chance of getting into advanced strategy. So let's just jump right into it. We're going to go through each of these tips one by one, and as always, if you have any comments or questions, do not hesitate to leave one down below. Alright, so the first leak that tends to absolutely plague intermediate players is actually overcomplicating decisions, both pre-flop and post-flop. It's actually very common for intermediate players who have done some study and really started to build some knowledge around this game for them to start overcomplicating their decisions and making elaborate plays that really just aren't well placed in terms of the overall games and or players they're playing against. And if you're making this mistake, you're not alone, but it's really important that you identify it quickly. And I think this leak has become more and more prevalent as GTO poker has boomed in popularity, since new players tend to totally ignore GTO in the first place and advanced players are usually very into it. The intermediate players tend to not really know exactly what to do with it. They might dip their toe into solvers or just exploring the general GTO outputs, but they're not really sure what to do with it. Oftentimes what you will find is intermediate players are saying, okay, I'm going to look at GTO here and just try to emulate it perfectly as best as I possibly can. And what they do is end up overcomplicating decisions. They end up continuing way too often when nits are firing at them. They end up holding back bluffs against fishy opponents when they could have easily value bet more profitably. And you find this kind of overcomplication happening a lot, and oftentimes they're just going to blame GTO and say, oh, well, I'm doing what the solver says to do, so forget it, I don't know what the heck to make of this. And I understand that, but this is where you really have to understand GTO versus exploitative play and understand where you are, and of course which strategy you should be bending toward more often given the situation you are in. So if you constantly find yourself making these unsuccessful plays simply because GTO told you to, definitely make sure to simmer down a little bit, get back to more fundamental strategies, and then go forward from there. Do not overcomplicate it. Do not get into FPS, that fancy play syndrome. It's just typically a massive trap for intermediate players. The second tip is to make sure that as an intermediate player, you do not abandon game selection. Now this is a leak that I think tends to bend 2 different ways. First is the actual game that you are playing in, and second is the actual limit or stake you're playing at. So as for the actual stake, intermediate players are very interesting. They tend to understand where they should not be playing, right? They tend not to play incredibly high. They tend to play in games overall, or at least at stakes and levels where they can have a good, decent edge, or at least are competitive and are doing better than break even. Versus newer players don't really know where the heck to go, and advanced players typically don't go down to the smallest stakes. So intermediate players kind of understand where they're supposed to be. However, there is a big issue here where a lot of intermediate players will actually play probably a limit or so too low, whereas they could still have a decent edge and probably make a better hourly by going to the next level up. This is where taking shots aggressively is very, very important, and if you're interested in learning how to do that well, definitely make sure to watch that video right up there. I'll leave a card for the 15-2 rule. Very, very good bankroll management strategy if you're looking for one right this moment. But where intermediate players tend to actually really go wrong is in the specific game that they decide to play in, and oftentimes they're playing in games that don't really reflect their edges. So an intermediate player should have a decent idea of what their edge is, what kind of player pools, what kind of lineups do they tend to perform best in. If you don't right this moment, take a moment, think about it. Do you do better in a game that's a little bit tighter, in a game that's really splashy and fishy, something in between? That is a very, very good thing to understand about yourself. So for instance, if you perform best in a game with a bunch of meh regs and then 1, maybe 2 fish, then you should be desperately seeking that kind of game out, rather than just sitting down at any old table and never moving. You might need to hop around a little bit, you might need to schedule when your sessions are based upon finding that game. If you perform best in absolutely splashy games, then probably Friday nights and Saturday nights are going to be your best time to play. But if you perform best in other environments, then you might need to look for other games at different times of the day that tend to work best for, again, you and your skill set. And if you don't know that stuff, again, spend a moment and really write that down and think about which kind of games are best for you. Number 3 is that intermediate players sometimes get too attached to certain hands. So one of the things that intermediate players really start to understand is that they don't want to be overly nitty, they don't want to overfold, they don't want to get totally run over. It doesn't mean that they won't, but they try not to get completely obliterated and let any aggression really run them over at the end of the day, which of course is a good thing. However, you have to know your opponent. It's very common for intermediate players to leverage things like the GTO knowledge and stick around in spots where they're giving action with these medium strength hands way too lightly, again based upon who their opponent is. If your opponent's a GTO bot, sure, you should be sticking around a pretty decent chunk of the time. You should definitely not be overfolding because you will get absolutely obliterated. However, when you're playing against a nit, why are you constantly jamming ace king against them preflop? Why are you constantly sticking around and hero calling the river with second or third pair when it's like, okay, they very clearly are telling you they have a better hand. Intermediate players do not want to get run over, that's great, but at the behest of constantly hero calling or constantly jamming off in bad spots preflop, this is going to be a massive leak point. Which brings us to leak number 4, and that is simply failing to adjust to your opponents. Now I find this one really interesting because intermediate players typically understand that they should be paying attention to their opponents, they should be looking for exploits against their opponent, and they should be implementing those exploits whenever possible. That of course is all well and good and correct. However, the issue is that intermediate players also tend to be looking for simplification whenever possible to make life a little bit easier, allow them to put in more volume, and just make life simpler at the end of the day, which I totally understand. But in this pursuit of simplification, oftentimes there's going to be some pretty big mistakes that get made. There's going to be an incorrect assessment when it comes to assigning a player type. For instance, they may just say, oh, well, my opponent's clearly a tag here, and this is what I do against tags. But tags can be very different. There are tags that are a little bit more passive, there are tags that are very spewy on turns and rivers, there are lots of different variations of simple player type buckets. So you don't just want to very quickly lump someone into a player type bucket and just leave them there without updating it, paying more attention, and getting more granular with the reads as you get more information against your opponent. But the other part of that simplification coin is that it's not uncommon for an intermediate player to look at something like GTO and say, oh, this is the perfect simplification silver bullet, right? I just have to constantly continue with this amount of hands post-flop, I just have to constantly play these kind of hands pre-flop, and then all is well and good, everything is super simple, I can never make a mistake. Of course, forgetting that that's against a perfect GTO opponent, and your opponents are humans and not perfectly GTO. So because of that, you definitely can't just blindly use GTO in all situations, especially when you have information on, hey, these are the strategic issues my opponent has, and as such, you should be looking to exploit them instead of just constantly saying, oh, well, I have to continue because GTO told me to. Not really, especially again, when you have that information on your opponents. And if you're paying enough attention, and again, getting granular with that information as more and more time and more hands unfold against that opponent, that is going to be better to use that exploitative approach instead. Another mistake that intermediate players tend to make is ignoring table image, and more specifically, their own table image. And a lot of this stems from the fact that intermediate players tend to be trying to pay a lot of attention to their opponents, trying to think about what they're doing, what they're likely to do, and then making decisions, forgetting sometimes to pause, zoom out, and think about how other people might be thinking about them. How aggressive have they been? How active have they been? How card dead have they been and just folding preflop? These are things you definitely want to be paying attention to, especially against thinking opponents who of course are paying attention to those things as well, but even not so great players. Lots of fishy players can still say, hey, that person looks really active or that person looks really tight, and you can use these to your advantage, but if you totally ignore them, you're going to be doing yourself a disservice. So some easy spots to look for this would be preflop when looking for extra 3-bets, especially when you've been particularly card dead at a table and you're looking at a spot where a reg opens. Well, maybe take advantage of that with some lighter 3-betting, because they're likely going to say, oh, you have to be pretty nitty just based upon the way you've been folding, and as such, you can 3-bet and take advantage of the fact that they're probably at a frequency level going to be folding against that 3-bet at a much higher frequency. And you can also do this for things post-flop, especially double and triple barrels, overbets, all those sorts of fun things, even check raises on the flop. These can be excellent ways to take advantage of it, especially when you've been a little bit tighter and you can take advantage of people who are just simply going to overfold against you. And then the sixth area where intermediate players tend to make some mistakes is in bet sizing. So earlier I mentioned that intermediate players tend to be quite focused on trying to find simplifications that work, and bet sizing is one of the areas where players tend to like to get very simplified. They're just going to use a basic bet sizing strategy whenever possible. They use the common multipliers pre-flop when it comes to things like 3-betting or open raising. They tend to use very similar c-betting sizing and check raise sizing and turn barrel sizing, etc. And it's usually somewhere between third-ish pot and full pot, and sometimes more intermediate players might throw in some overbetting or even slightly smaller betting, but typically it's going to be in that range, especially for cash game players. And that's not to say that your current bet sizing strategy is terrible or a losing bet sizing strategy, but it might not be optimal for your given situation. And if you're constantly just trying to again use that one size fits all approach, you're going to miss out on very key opportunities where you can maximize your win rate because you're just trying to stick to something that's basic and easy instead of optimal to the given situation you're in. So if you're constantly finding yourself using the same sizing in all situations, spend a couple of minutes, really work through why you're doing that, and look at a couple of spots in depth, some very specific hand histories, and say what could a better sizing strategy be in this particular spot. By exercising that muscle, you're going to start being able to find better situations in real time to deviate and get into some more optimized sizing. So if you were to zoom out at this point and look at all the leaks that we talked about in this video so far, you'd see a very common theme arising, and that is that intermediate players are usually doing things a little bit too simplified, a little bit too much one size fits all, and they're not getting in there and optimizing well enough. The optimizing is really the key variable between intermediate and advanced play. It's not being able to memorize more GTO solves or anything like that. It's being able to understand what to look for, how to get in there and find those maximal exploits, and when to pull the trigger and exactly how to pull the trigger. Again, specifications like bet sizing being one of those key elements. So if you're looking for more information on how to break out of that winning but probably not optimized strategy you're currently using, I would definitely make sure to check out the course Deviate from Red Chip Poker. Deviate is a 26 video course that in a nutshell is comprised of two interrelated analyses based upon population tendencies. First, it's going to identify the ways in which your opponents deviate from GTO play, and second, it takes those results to determine how you can most profitably deviate from GTO to punish your opponent's deviations. To learn more about this course and enroll today, go to redchippoker.com/deviate, learn all about it, and if you're really looking to get between intermediate and advanced play, this is a course I would highly recommend. But anyway, that's going to wrap it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed. If you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to let me know, and of course a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video would be massively appreciated as well. Otherwise, we'll see you back shortly with a brand new video, and in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.